Choreographies of spatial labor as critical spatial practice. Critical spatial practices, as defined by Jane Rendell, are reflective and take into account their own procedures and methods, and they operate in a more expanded field than architectural practice typically includes. Rendell further argues that interdisciplinary research calls into question the ideological apparatus that structures the terms and methods of specific disciplinary practices. Interdisciplinary research questions dominant processes that seek to control intellectual and creative production and instead generate new resistant forms and modes of knowledge and understanding. My moving between discourses and practices of architecture, installation, and performance, and in interdisciplinary collaborations leads me to argue that performance challenges, to borrow John Mackenzie's phrase, and that performative spatial practices offer critical tools to crack open and productively undo foreclosed architectural objects and to reveal their methods of production. The choreographies of labor that I have been developing through the creative work interned reveal hidden cycles of making and unmaking, mechanisms of invisibility, and call attention to architectures used politically to construct an uneven distribution of the sensible and to hide from view disenfranchised populations. While I share with you the first draft of the documentation of Interned, my intention in this presentation is to rehearse theories put into practice through choreographies of spatial labor, to interrogate performativities latent within architectural artifacts, and to articulate the value that performance contributes towards a critical spatial practice. What are choreographies of spatial labor? Allow me to start by unpacking a few terms, such as choreography, in relationship to architecture or spatial design. Choreographer William Forsythe offers a definition that bridges between these two spatial practices, stating that, quote, choreography is about organization. Either you're organizing the body, or bodies with other bodies, or a body with other bodies in an environment that is organized, end quote. Taking the arrow of Forsythe's statement in the opposite direction, architecture may be defined as the organizing of space, spaces in relation to other sub- and superspaces, and in relation to bodies. Next, let me define labor as differentiated from work. Hannah Arendt suggests that work is related to Homo faber's fabrication of things, ideas, instruments, and works. Labor, by contrast, is associated with the tasks of the body that attend to physical upkeep and survival. It is an ongoing, repetitive activity that does not yield works per se. When explored in relation to architecture and built space, work is associated with the activity of those designing and constructing the building. To borrow Elaine Scarry's terms, making up and making real. Yet the work of making up and making real is distinct from labor, which in its ongoingness applies to the task of building, upkeep, maintenance, an activity that architect Hilary Sample declares obscene. It's worth noting that that which is obscene etymologically is that which is off-stage or off-scene or off-screen, not to be seen. Now let's not overlook the various types of architectural work that are also out of sight, such as the work of interns, or migrant laborers, or offshore subcontractors, those that Peggy Deemer, Mabel Wilson, and Kanambari Bakshi have been interrogating. In order to see all of the forms of labor entangled with architecture, it may be helpful to consider the full cycle of built space, including not only making, but also maintaining, unmaking, and iterative remaking. While making results in a work, samples label obscene suggest that maintenance and unmaking, as well as the actions and actors associated with the unbecoming unmaking of space, are activities to be kept out of sight, invisible. The choreographies of spatial labor explored and interned organized bodies laboring at the making, unmaking, and remaking of space with the intention of shifting the focus away from the concluded architectural artifact towards an experience of laborers and laboring, thereby critiquing and subverting the normative rendering of labor as invisible, obscene, and off-screen. The choreographies of spatial labor, in turn, reflect on particular entanglements of politics, architecture, labor, and invisibility. The spaces of internment of Japanese Americans during World War II and the forms of labor that occurred there, as well as the spaces of detention that support the contemporary executive orders. Some facts concerning those spaces. In 1942, Franklin Delano Roosevelt authored a series of executive orders that called into being a military exclusion zone stretching along the entire Pacific coast of the United States, and created a wartime administration to manage the relocation and confinement of over 110,000 Japanese American citizens and residents in 18 temporary assembly centers and 10 longer-term, purpose-built relocation centers to house between 8 and 18,000 persons each. These camps were located in remote areas of the western United States, and the interned populations were supposed to support themselves through agricultural labor at substandard wages, and contract labor for the U.S. military. The contract work included weaving camouflage and fabricating scale models of ships for use by the Navy. In the camps within the boundaries of the Gila River Indian community, internees additionally fabricated adobe bricks for the construction of their community buildings not provided by the U.S. government. The 4 camps in which camouflage work for the military was carried out and where I conducted on-site research have all been razed. What remains are concrete slabs, heaps of rubble, or no trace at all. Fast forward to 2017. 1 week after taking office, the 45th U.S. government authored 2 executive orders, one banning visas to persons from 7 Muslim-majority countries, and the other mandating a wall be built along the southern border. How to critically reflect on architectures of internment, the labors that occurred there, the texts and master plan drawings that called these conditions into being. Through performative spatial practices, in turn, questions the dominant order of things, foregrounding labor, and that of the unmaking of texts and drawings that call architectures of confinement into being. In turn, foregrounds the labor of iteratively unmaking and remaking scaled models of no longer visible spaces of internment. The choreographed labor forestalls the appearance of the architectural works, the internment camps and detention centers that in turn reflects upon. In addition to rendering visible the labor entangled with the making up, making real, and its unmaking, in turn dramaturgically explores conventions and mechanisms of visibility and representation, impacting how and what we see or don't see. As architects, we are familiar with our works occurring at a spatial, temporal, and scalar remove from the full-scale works through architects' drawings and specifications. The works are made visible to the mind through instruments of representation and to world through the instruments of fabrication. Different modes of representation invite different modes of reflection and sets of questions. Orthographic plan drawings allow us to organize relations, chart and choreograph trajectories and movements of bodies in space. Parallel projections afford a three-dimensional overview, and historically were used to instruct armies in the building of fortifications. 1- and 2-point perspectives locate the body of an observer in relation to spaces and others being observed, at once simulating the experience of being physically present and suggesting the power to see and be seen. These three vantage points and the association of orthographics with architects, axonometry with the military, and perspective with the embodied presence of laborers inform the means used to document in turn, as well as the means to make visible, whether directly or mediated. Thus, choreographed labor and questions of visibility are dramaturgically entangled. Spatial labor of deploying bricks or barrack models is immediately present and unmediated, facilitating a dialogue between trained laborers and audience members who they may invite to help build. Audience members also become impromptu performers in their traversing the performance area, motivated by their curiosity to explore activity and the artifacts situated around the space, such as material samples, tools, and molds used to make the paper bricks. Text excerpts pinned up in proximity to the artifacts deployed around the space define stations through which a narrator moves. A surveillance videographer traces the boundary around the laborers, like the barbed wire fence and watchtowers that delineate the internment camps. Projections on scrims stand in for the sublime landscapes of the Sonora and Mojave deserts, Inyo National Forest, and San Gabriel Mountains seen from within the former camps. Through these projections, the site becomes present in the non-site of the gallery. And through these projections, we perceive on-site performances, setting up and removing camp models. Interspersed between these video clips, the vacant yards of contemporary detention centers are made present. Throughout, we hear the rumble of wind moving through these uninhabited places of confinement. The performers of whiting out and erasure take their place at the boundary, at a remove from the labor of making and unmaking. Their actions are mediated and transferred onto the ground and scrims. Undeniably, the researching, making, and performing of in turn draws from and is inseparable from several types of architecture entangled artifacts. Government utterances in the form of written executive orders that call into being exclusion zones, camps, and constructed barriers. The drawn master plans instruct the layouts of blocks consisting of 14 20-foot by 100-foot barrack buildings and support facilities. The master plan patterns inform the scripted portions of the choreographed labor. Just as the interned could build spaces of representation and places to perform citizenry in the gaps between the blocks, improvised constructions similarly fill the temporal gaps between predetermined models. If performance is challenged, then my challenge has been to perform spatial architectural practices critically. I question not only history's repetitions, but also how, through performance, to consider architectural practices and artifacts otherwise, and the labor in their making, unmaking, and remaking. This shift from the thing to the doing opens these texts, drawings, and models to the possibility, the imperative of revision. In erasing the master plan drawings, whiting out the executive orders, and unmaking the camp models, the possibility for a different narrative, a different space becomes possible. The pages of text, drawings, and space of the choreographed labor are palimpsests, in which the traces of what came before lingers, so that we continue to recall and question future actions. In sharing with you these reflections on the research, frameworks, and practices that informed the performance of Interned, I hope to instigate your own questioning of how performance may challenge and afford a greater criticality to spatial practice. Thank you.